We're about to jump into the deep end of normative economics, where we have to make the decisions about what to do with the information we're given. The U.S. government defines poverty as, well, they don't technically define poverty, but they define the official poverty threshold, a minimum annual income that is considered adequate to purchase the necessities of life. Families whose incomes fall below these poverty thresholds are considered poor. Now, fighting poverty is a big deal in the United States. Almost every president over the last 75 years has made some initiative or push, or at least talked about wanting to make some push to reduce the levels of poverty. And anti-poverty programs account for a significant part of our welfare state in the U.S., the system by which the government takes responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. Now, the official poverty threshold is adjusted every year, reflecting changes in the cost of living. However, it is not adjusted upwards to reflect the long-term rise in the standard of living of the average American family. So as the economy has grown more prosperous and average incomes have risen, while one might have expected the percentage of the population living below the poverty line to decline, we see that not happening. The U.S. poverty rate, the percentage of the population with incomes below the poverty threshold, has fluctuated up and down with no clear trend over the last 50 years. So, the real question is, who are the poor people of the U.S.? There's, of course, that stereotyped image of poverty, and it's not completely off base, because poverty is disproportionately high among minorities as well as female-headed households. However, a majority of the poor don't fit this stereotype. In 2012, about 46.5 million Americans were in poverty. 15% of the population, or about 1 in 7 persons, were considered poor using that poverty threshold that the government defines that we talked about earlier. Within these two groups, 1/4 of the poor were African American, and a roughly equal number were Hispanic. And between these two groups, poverty rates were well above the national average, 27.2% and 25.6%, respectively. But there was also widespread poverty among non-Hispanic whites, who had a poverty rate of 9.7%. Of course, you also have the female-headed households, with no husband present, had a high poverty rate at 33.9%. Married couples were much less likely to be poor, with a poverty rate of only 6.3%, but still about 40% of poor families were married couples. So, this affects everybody, but like all things, it does affect some groups more than others. What really stands out from this data, however, is the association between poverty and the lack of adequate employment. Adults who work full-time are very unlikely to be poor, but adults who worked part-time or not at all made up almost 85.4% of the poor back in 2012 when all this data was collected. Particularly in the retail and service sectors, your McDonald's, your JCPenney's, these businesses now rely primarily on part-time workers. It lacks the benefits of health plans, paid vacation days, and retirement benefits, and usually pays a lower hourly wage than comparable full-time work. So many of the poor are members of what analysts call the working poor, workers whose income falls below or at the poverty threshold. This is something we're going to want to know for the AP exam, knowing the causes of poverty, as it may show up in the multiple choice section. So I'm going to go through some of the causes of poverty. It's often blamed on a lack of education, and educational attainment clearly has a strong positive effect on the income level. On average, those with more education earn a higher income with those with less education. We talk about this with the factor markets, right? Where it's an increase in human capital, basically improving the productivity of a single worker by investing in that resource. For example, in 1979, the average hourly wage of men with a college degree was 38% higher than that of men with only a high school diploma. And by 2013, the college premium had increased to 83%, right? That's why you have so many teachers who say that a college degree is almost necessary in today's time and in today's day and age, because it's a necessity to be able to live. Of course, discrimination is also baked into our educational institutions, so that's where some of that comes in to talk about the numbers that we discussed earlier. Non-whites earn less and are less likely to be employed than whites with comparable levels of education. Studies find that African American males suffer persistent discrimination by employees in favor of whites. African American women and Hispanic immigrants, women earn lower incomes than men with similar qualifications. Now, the consequences of poverty are very severe, especially for children. 21.8% of children in the United States currently live in poverty, it's often associated with a lack of access to health care, which can lead to further health problems that erode the ability to attend school and work later in life. We've already talked about how education is important. If poverty is causing these kids to not get an education, well, it's becoming a dangerous cycle for them. Affordable housing is also frequently a problem, leading poor families to move often and disrupting school and work schedules, again, which isn't helping any of these families get out of poverty. The United States, now we're going to talk a little bit about economic inequality. I can't just skip from section to section. That is my bad. Sorry. So, the United States is a rich country, of course. In 2012, the average U.S. household had an income of more than $71,000, far exceeding the poverty threshold. So how is it possible that so many Americans still live in poverty? The answer is that income is unequally distributed, with many households earning much less than the average and others earning much more. This is going to be talking about the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient, which we're going to toss over to the chalkboard in just a couple of seconds. I'm going to read a couple more definitions to you, straight out of the book, exactly how you're going to need to know them for the AP test. Let's see. The mean household income is the average income across all households in the country. The median household income is the income of the household lying in the middle of the income distribution. It's important to realize that these two numbers do not measure the same thing. Economists often illustrate the difference by asking people to first imagine a room containing several dozen more or less ordinary wage earners, and then think about what happens to the mean and medium incomes of the people in the room if a billionaire Wall Street tycoon walks in. The mean income soars because the tycoon's income pulls up the average, but the median income hardly rises at all. That's why economists generally regard median income as a better guide to the economic status of typical American families. What we've learned is that the income in the United States is quite unequally distributed. The average income of the poorest fifth of families is less than a quarter of the average income of families in the middle, and the richest fifth have the average income more than 3 times of that of families in the middle. On average, the income of the richest fifth of the population are about 15 times as high as those of the poorest fifth. And, in fact, the distribution of income in America has become so unequal since 1980s, rising to a level that has made it a significant political issue. So, now we can get into the good stuff and throw it over to the Lorenz curve over on the chalkboard.
The Lorenz curve, yet another graph for us to learn about. So, again, it's a graph. We're going to build that And on our x-axis, we're going to have the percent of population, and on the y, the percent of income. Then we're going to draw this in here. I like to use a dotted line for this one, but I suppose you could use a straight line too. It's really a matter of personal preference. But that's going to be your line of equality. And then we're going to have this thing right here, which is the actual Lorenz curve. There you go. And then there are two areas that you're going to need to look at on here. Area A, area B. And why do we know A and B? For the Gini coefficient, which is A over A plus B. Now let's take a quick moment and look at this. Let's say that A was the entire area, and one person owned all the wealth in the entire thing, and there was no B. The Gini coefficient would be 1, which is perfect inequality. Now, if it was all B and A was 0, you'd get 0 over the entirety of B, or 0 over 100, which would be perfect equality. Now the goal isn't perfect equality, it's just to have a Gini coefficient that's closest to perfect equality, or closer to perfect equality. And you can see that with a variety of different countries and where their Gini coefficients are located.
Now, I mentioned earlier the welfare states. We're going to talk a little bit about the rationale for it. The rationale for the welfare state rests in part on the benefits of reducing economic insecurity, which afflicts even relatively well-off families. One source of this insecurity is the risk of a sudden loss of income, such as if a family member suddenly lost their job, or has to spend an extended period without work, or is forced to take a new job that pays considerably less. In a given year, about 1 in 6 American families will see their income cut in half unexpectedly. Related estimates show that the percentage of people who find themselves below the poverty threshold for at least 1 year over the course of a decade is several times higher than the percentage of people below the poverty threshold in any given year. Even if a family doesn't face a loss in income, they can suffer a surge of expenses, such as unexpected hospital bills, or home repairs, or some expense that they didn't think they were going to have to pay that still completely destroys their budget. It does the same thing, because when you're living above your means, which having a horrible thing happen to you pushes you above your means, it's the same as if you lose that income, right? Despite the fact that you're not technically losing that income, right? It still kind of screws you over in the same way. Now, there are 3 huge programs in the United States that are classified as anti-poverty programs: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. All things that the baby boomers are not leaving for my generation. Not that I'm bitter about it. But there's also a couple other big programs: the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, the Supplemental Nutrition Association Program, and the Earned Income Tax Credit, as well as a small number of smaller programs. There are different types of ways to categorize these programs. Most commonly, you'll see if they're means tested, basically that they're only available to individuals or families whose incomes fall below a certain level. They could also be non-means tested, which provide their benefits to everybody, though in practice these tend to reduce income inequality by increasing the incomes of the poor by a larger proportion than the incomes of the rich. There's also in-kind benefits, which are given in the forms of goods or services, or there are programs that just give straight, cold, hard cash to the people who need it. A negative income tax is a program that supplements the income of low-income workers. Basically welfare, which is monetary aid to poor families. The main source of such aid in the United States is the TANF, or the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. This program does not aid everyone who's poor. It's only available to poor families with children, and only available for a temporary period of time. The old program was widely accused of creating perverse incentives for the poor, encouraging family breakup. The AFDC, we're not going to get into that because from what it sounds in the book, nobody liked it. But anyway, TANF is a relatively small part of the current U.S. welfare state. But other means-tested programs, though more expensive, are less controversial, like Supplemental Social Income Program provides aid for disabled Americans who are unable to work. So Social Security is the largest program in the U.S. welfare state. It's a non-means-tested program that guarantees retirement income to qualifying older Americans. It also provides benefits to workers who become disabled and survivor benefits to family members of workers who die. Social Security is supported by a dedicated tax on wages. The Social Security portion on a payroll tax pays for Social Security benefits. Makes sense, right? The benefits workers receive on retirement depends on their taxable earnings during their working years. The more you earn, up to the maximum amount subject to Social Security taxes, the more money you receive in retirement. Again, I'm not going to receive anything because the program is probably going to fall apart before I get to retirement. But again, I'm not bitter. Since most senior citizens don't receive pensions from former employers and most don't earn enough assets to live off the income from these assets, Social Security benefits are an enormously important source of income for them. 64% of Americans 65 and older rely on Social Security for more than half their income. 35% of those rely on Social Security for 90% or more of their income. Unemployment insurance is a much smaller governmental transfer, but it's another key social insurance program, providing workers who lose their jobs with about 35% of their previous salary until they find a new job or until 26 weeks have passed. Sometimes this period gets extended if the economy is in a slump and there aren't that many jobs. It's financed by a tax on employers. So the people who receive these government transfers tend to be different from the people who are taxed to pay for the transfers. So the U.S. welfare state is attempting to redistribute this income from some people to the other. There's a report every year from the Census Bureau that calculates only the direct effects of taxes and transfers, not taking into account changes in behavior that the taxes and transfers might cause, it doesn't bother trying to estimate how many older Americans would still be working if they weren't receiving Social Security checks. So it's only a partial indicator of the true effects of the welfare state. However, the results are striking. There is fierce debate over income redistribution, as I'm sure anyone who has ever turned on the news has heard. The goal seems laudable: help the poor, protect everyone from financial risk, and ensure that people can afford essential health care. But good intentions don't always make for good policy, and there is an intense debate on how large the anti-poverty program should be, which really reflects the differences in philosophy, but also reflects concerns about possibly counterproductive effects of anti-poverty programs. There are two different lines of arguments against anti-poverty programs. One is based on philosophical concerns about the proper role of government. Some people believe that the government should not redistribute income. The government's role should be limited to maintaining the rule of law, providing public goods, and managing externalities. Yeah, I did my video on public goods already. I'm fine. However, the trade-off between anti-poverty programs and high marginal tax rates seem to suggest that we should try to hold down the cost of these programs. One way to do this would be means testing benefits, but means testing can create a different type of trade-off between equity and efficiency. Basically, people worry that should someone be receiving more off government benefits than they would with a job, they're going to stay on government benefits because it's a better trade-off for them, right? The benefit versus the cost of them taking a job is no bueno, so they will not do so. Oh boy, this is fun. Are you ready for this paragraph? In 1791, In the early phase of the French Revolution, France had a sort of Congress, the National Assembly, in which representatives were seated according to social class. Nobles, who pretty much liked the things way worse, sat on the right. Commoners, who wanted big changes, sat on the left. Ever since, it has been common in political discourse to talk about politicians as being on the right, more conservative, or on the left, more liberal. That had nothing to do with economics at all. And I'm a little mad that I just read it, but it is a little fascinating. So, what do modern politicians on the left and right disagree about? They disagree about the size of anti-poverty programs. Yes, we all know that. Can economic analysis help resolve this political conflict? Only up to a point. Some of the political controversy over the welfare state involves differences in opinions about the trade-offs that we've discussed. If you believe that the disincentive effects of generous benefits and high taxes are large, you're likely to look less favorably on welfare state programs than if you believe they're fairly small. Economic analysis, by improving our knowledge of the fact, can help resolve some differences, but not all of them. To an important extent, however, differences on opinion and income redistribution reflect differences in values and philosophies, and those are differences that economics can't resolve. This is Duncan Fox driving away for AP Economics. We'll see you next time, guys.